After having played Elden Ring for 90 plus hours, the game is not a masterpiece, but it's pretty damn close. Let's take a look at the one thing holding it back. A masterpiece is a very subjective view of a piece of art. Now, for example, Knights of the Old Republic or KOTOR, in my eyes, is a masterpiece, whereas other people may disagree, and that's perfectly okay. It's all really in the eye of the beholder. But Souls games or Soul-like games are a genre that have been very niche until now. Does a genre-defining game mean that a game is a masterpiece? Or does a game that has great gameplay mean that it's a masterpiece? Or even more so, a game that has a really good story? Do those all mean that a game is a masterpiece? Well, yes and no. But for me personally, Elden Ring is a game that is missing a very specific piece that holds it back from being a masterpiece, and that is its story.
Awaiting the arrival of the Elden Lord. Unless, of course, thou shouldst take the crown.
FromSoftware has been creating really hard games since 1997 when it came out with Armored Core on the original PlayStation, and I actually really loved that game when it came out. The first Demon's Souls game came out on the PlayStation 3 in 2009, and although games wouldn't be defined as a Souls-like game, for quite a while this is where it all started. Now, Souls games, beyond just being known for their difficulty level, are also known for having a very rich lore, but not much in the way of story or plot. And since then, we've seen Dark Souls 1 through 3, we've seen a remake, we've seen Bloodborne, Sekiro, which I still haven't made it beyond the first level of that game, and most recently Elden Ring. Now, although I've tried various Souls games in the past, I've tried Sekiro, and it just wasn't until Elden Ring came out that I've really dove headlong into a FromSoftware game. It's also super rare for me to go and dive into a 90 plus hour play session overall for a game, especially with the kind of time constraints I have at this point in time. Now, although I love the gameplay in Elden Ring, I can't sit there and, like, when I'm not playing that game, I'm thinking about how I can get that next talisman or that next legendary sorcery or whatever the case ends up being. I love the gameplay of this game. I love how the mechanics work. I love the world that it's sitting in. But again, my biggest hitch on this game that's really holding it back is the overall story. And let me tell you why.
A vision? A vision of what?
Now, as I mentioned, Knights of the Old Republic or KOTOR is one of the masterpieces in my mind. So for me, KOTOR is a masterpiece. Overall, it had great gameplay, it had great exploration, it had great quests, it had great characters, and it had a great story. Now, it's the story for me that was really the thing driving me, that kept me engaged and actually made me care about the characters. Whether it was HK-47 calling everybody meatbags, Karth being the voice of reason, or Basileus just being a dogmatic Jedi at the beginning of the game, there was a lot to the overall story, a lot to the characters, and there was still some left up to interpretation of where things are actually going. Now, before we had midichlorians, we had an energy field that surrounded us and bound us. It was the Force, and it was something that wasn't implicitly or explicitly defined, at least until the midichlorian thing. But there's a lot of Star Wars lore baked into that game that left a lot of interpretation, but also left a lot of context. And what this really meant was that I understood why. I understood why the characters were going after what they were going after. I understood why the bad guy was who they were and why there was different shifts in allegiances. I understood why they had the different perspectives that they had. It was that underlying why for the story that really drove things forward for me. Which leads me back to Elden Ring, which is where that was actually missing for me. The why. That is until I beat the game. Now, when I beat the game, I got Ronnie's ending, and after I finished watching that ending, I had to ask myself, what the fuck did I just watch? I literally had no idea. I was so confused about what I just watched. So, what does one do when you're confused about watching an ending? Well, you go to the YouTubes, of course. So I went to the YouTubes. I started watching videos on what the actual ending meant and what different interpretations of what it meant. And what that did is it didn't provide me context for the ending. It just gave me that interpretation. So what I had to do was I had to dive more into the lore to understand the context of why those things were happening, which then tied me directly to the ending that I saw. So I watched a couple different lore videos, which I'll put in the description and link at the end of the video. And it wasn't until I dove into that lore that it provided me the context and the why. Now, there is a lot of lore when it comes to Elden Ring, and the lore is actually where a lot of those interesting tidbits and context are actually left. Now, I do understand why FromSoftware went this route, and this is how they wanted to do their storytelling. I totally understand where they were coming from, but for me personally, it just didn't land. And that's why this story was a big miss for me, is because it actually requires you to go through the lore, which is immense, to really understand what's going on, get the overall context, and start to piece everything together. Now, I don't know if you remember Destiny 1 and the developmental hell that it went through, but its overall story was basically a hot mess. But you still had a lot of this lore that supplemented a lot of that hot mess, and it kind of alluded to a much bigger world than what you were seeing in this particular story, and that's kind of what I'm getting to with Elden Ring. In Elden Ring, if you really want the story, you have to dive into the lore to better understand the context and the why of what's actually going on. Now, for me personally, that's why I feel this is a big miss and why it's not a masterpiece in my mind. I would love to have seen a story, even if it was just a main through line story that you went through and you were going and establishing why your character was doing what it was doing and seeing the political intrigue and the different moving pieces that were going on. All that ancillary stuff could have been lore related, but you had just a straight through line of the story of your character from the beginning to the end. And then if you wanted additional context around the other players and the other gods and the other demigods and everything that was going on, then you could dive into that lore if you really wanted to. But the way Elden Ring has positioned itself, you don't get any of that context in the story at all. It's on the player to dive into that world where like I said, I understand where they were coming from. I just wish there was more of an actual story in place first that all this stuff kind of tied into and really brought together. So when I did get to that ending sequence and I saw that ending cinematic, I was like, oh, that is amazing. I loved that ending instead of, what the fuck did I just watch? Now, I'm going to leave you with this when it comes to Elden Ring. The intro cinematic, and I'm not going to spoil anything, but that opening cinematic is a fallacy. And I say that because it's part of the story, but it's not at the same time. And as you dive into a lot of these lore videos, if you so choose to, you'll actually see what I mean and what the context is around what is being portrayed at the beginning of the game, and then what you're potentially seeing by the time you end the game. So I'm just going to kind of leave that there as a little tidbit for you. Whether you take it or not, totally up to you, but it does add a lot of context if you want to better understand Elden Ring and the story that it's trying to tell. Now, that's why I feel Elden Ring is not a masterpiece. It's that one thing holding it back. Now, if you want more unsolicited opinions, make sure to check out my video going over why I feel E3 being canceled is a good thing. And if you want to learn more about those lore videos, go ahead and check those out, and I'll see you over there.